Let me check my back pocket. Oops, nope, not there either. There is no magic solution. Part of the challenge is the fact that there's an open question about who's going to do anything about it. Our typical approaches to security over the last few decades have been, put another Band-Aid on, put another lock, put another moat around yourself. But, I like to say this is a problem that we can't two-factor ourselves out of.
Yeah.
Because the people who really need to act are the ones who are running the networks.
You're listening to Ping, a podcast by APNIC discussing all things related to measuring the internet. I'm your host, George Michelson. I recently caught up with Leslie Daigle again, this time at IETF Bangkok. Leslie is from Global Cyber Alliance. I spoke to her in January of last year about GCA and their Honeynet, a large system of deliberately insecure, publicly visible hosts on the internet. GCA operate this to see what kinds of attack traffic are active and where they're coming from. GCA also now supports the MANRS initiative, the mutually assured norms for routing security. We've discussed this on Ping with Andrei Robchevsky. Leslie has been exploring the data that GCA's Honeynet shows. She's been talking about it with the operations community and finds herself asking questions which nobody seems to have answers for. What are we going to do to manage this bad traffic? It seems it may be moving from a technical question to one about governance of the wider public utility function, and how we need to think about the problem might now be moving from a technology solution question to social ones. Leslie, welcome back to Ping.
Thanks for having me.
So for people who didn't hear the episode you recorded sometime last year or maybe a little before, can you remind everyone who you are and what you do?
So my name is Leslie Daigle, and I'm the Chief Technical Officer and Director of the Internet Integrity Program at the Global Cyber Alliance, where we play with a number of technologies and data sources to look at what is going on in the internet and in terms of security and where are the problems. How can we build community to address them?
We recently talked with Andrei Robchevsky about MANRS. He was at the Pulse Internet Forum in Malaysia. That was really lovely, but it reminded me that you actually have this wider context. GCA has been doing an activity for a very, very long time, looking into the problem of bad traffic.
Since, the last 5 or 6 years, we've had a global honeyfarm that's got sensors deployed in about 200 countries across the globe, and it's just listening to see who's out there trying to attack open, mostly IPv4 ports. And it's really interesting to see how many different places those attacks are coming from, and how many attacks are coming from some places, and so on and so forth.
So when we talked last time, you went in some detail into how this technology works. But if we kind of summarize, the basic idea is you put a device, could be software running in a virtual machine, could be hardware, you put it up on the network. You don't have to tell people, hey, come to the door. People are just sending packets all the time to the entire v4 address space, finding what will respond, right?
Yes, it's kind of scary. There are a number of scans that happen daily. Some of them are not malicious. Some of them are well-intended and
measure the network,
yes,
see how many devices
absolutely
are active, whatever.
But others are literally probes for attackers that are out there poking to see who's got a door open, what can they access, where can they get in, and then that's just for probes. And then we see hundreds of thousands of attacks, millions of attacks, in fact, every day on our 200 sensors just sitting out there.
And these devices, in some ways, they kind of can pretend to be terribly managed, not updated web servers, mail servers, FTP servers.
Yes.
They present a front door that to a bad guy really looks attractive, which
yes.
means you get to see the more complex things going on in the system.
Yes. So largely they are set up so that almost any password will work, so that it's easy for the attacker to log in, and then we can see where are they downloading malware from, what commands are they trying to run, and so on. And in fact, something that has changed since we last spoke is we've changed out the technology that we're using for our honey farm. We have our own now, and it does support more than Telnet and SSH. It actually supports HTTP, HTTPS, and secure FTP.
Oh, that's really cool. Everything is sweetness and light in the internet, and we're all safe, and there are no major risks, right?
Yeah, if only that were the case. But in fact, really what we're finding, it's kind of like I got a new vacuum cleaner that has a little laser on the roller. So as I'm pushing around my vacuum cleaner, I can see just how disgustingly dirty my floors are, even as I'm vacuuming.
Yeah, I got that feature on mine,
yeah.
And it's kind of telling. It shows you where you should have been looking a lot harder.
And that's the same thing with this honey farm, is it's really highlighting just how much unwanted traffic there is on the internet.
Yeah.
And if you talk to a network operator, they kind of shrug and say, well, it's not clogging my pipes. What's the problem?
But there's a lot more going on here. There is a problem, right?
There is a problem. I think that one of the most visible problems happened in 2016 with the well-known Mirai attack on the Dyn servers, which caused DNS outages for major companies for several hours. And that was a pretty simple botnet that basically took over a number of IoT devices, simple IoT, really like cameras, small devices, sensors, and used them, marshaled them into an army, if you will, to launch the attack.
In the Asia-Pacific footprint, that they actually succeeded in taking over virtually an entire island economy in the Pacific's infrastructure and used it to marshal an attack. It was quite scary. And it's a threat in kind of many different directions, right? I mean, you focused in on the quality of how it affected Dyn, the DNS services or other services, but it also has reputational risk. If an entire nation state is suddenly visible as a source of this traffic, that's really bad.
It is really bad, and I'll actually jump off that point to observe that here we are, you and I are sitting in Thailand at the moment, and I went to connect to one of my services back home, for I think it was my to pick up my pay stub, and got a message back from the server that it says, "I'm sorry, we don't serve anybody coming from Thailand." I mean, literally, that's what the HTTP webpage said.
Their approach to dealing with the problem is, this is too hard to deal with. Let's just put everything into the bad camp.
Exactly, which is wrong on so many levels.
I have noticed myself using some services mediated through Cloudflare Warp that I'm having to walk through their "Are you really a person?" test a lot more. And I've had a couple of services I routinely log into from this laptop with cookies on this machine saying, you seem to be coming from a really strange economy. Can we do the two-factor check again?
Yep.
So I think that reputational harm problem is really very strong.
It's very strong, and it's persistent, because one of the features of blacklists is that however easy they are to get on them, they're very, very hard to get off.
We are so fond of saying, but I have a magic solution. So Leslie, tell me, you have a magic solution, right?
Let me check my back pocket. Oops, nope, not there either. There is no magic solution. Part of the challenge is the fact that there's an open question about who's going to do anything about it. Our typical approaches to security over the last few decades have been, put another Band-Aid on, put another lock, put another moat around yourself. But, I mean, I like to say this is a problem that we can't two-factor ourselves out of. Yeah. Because the people who really need to act are the ones who are running the networks.
This begs many questions. I actually don't really know where to begin here. Where are we going to cast this problem to start fishing around for a conversation that ultimately is going to lead to a solution? What are the questions we need to be asking?
One of the questions that I started asking actually at the RIPE meeting in May of 2022 was, what is a reasonable amount of this unwanted traffic to see coming out of a network?
Now that's quite an interesting point. My partner ran a small business, a bookshop, and she was quite over that if you're in trade, you just have to accept a certain level of theft is taking place. So it was routine for her to accept 5% stock loss. That was just a fact of life. Now, if you're a small trader in some cities that are under stress, maybe Baltimore or some of the West Coast cities in America, 5% would be nothing. You have a massive, massive problem, to the point that people are pulling stores out because it's uneconomic to keep trying to function. So the idea that there's an acceptable amount of crime it's kind of weird, but at the same time, it's well understood, right?
And it's well understood because you can understand that to get to 0% crime, you would have to compromise on too many other factors, such as, privacy and personal security, right? She's accepting that she's going to lose some number of books from the bookstore because she's not going to go through every person's bag when they leave the store.
Because they're a one-time customer
Right.
if you hassle them.
Exactly.
And I'm really, really interested. Did the right community actually come up with a number they could kind of...
They did not, and we'll put that down to my lack of skills in terms of guiding the discussion, or we didn't have opportunity to follow up or whatever. I'm still interested in pursuing that question.
Right, I think that is an amazing question.
And I think it's not even just a number of, it's not just the number of attacks, because as you say, different networks can be different sizes and whatever. But there are things like we had, in that presentation, I was looking at the number of attacks coming out of networks. So the top attacking network, the network that we saw the most attacks from in our network of sensors, the top network sent over 20 million attacks in a half-year period. And it's well, is that a lot? I don't know. Can we look at it in terms of number of attackers? So the top number of attackers in a given network was over 20,000 attackers in a network. Maybe that starts to be something you could notice. But is that really something you might notice without actually virtually going through the purses of every packet on your network as they go out the door? Well, how about the top number of attacks coming out of attacker? And we saw one network where there were 600,000 attacks coming from one attacker.
This kind of goes through a series of measures, a series of counts that lead you in a particular direction. If we just had better eyeballs on the problem, we might start to be able to quantify things. And once you quantify amounts, you can consider ratios. So it would be 20,000 things were emitting bad traffic out of a population of 100,000. Right. That could be a heck of a lot more scary than out of a population of 20 million.
Yes.
So there's an aspect which is we need to begin to measure how much people are emitting and what's the ratio to their actual scale and consequence. But when you come right down to, here's this one thing in the corner, this one IP address in this network that's emitting 600,000 attacks, it wouldn't matter if it was a giant net or a tiny net. You want to be able to deal with the problem.
Yeah, and you want to believe that networks might notice that kind of behavior at some level, because you also have to understand that's what we saw. But we aren't the only attacks. We're not advertising ourselves as some particular collective, right? They no doubt were sending that much traffic to every open IPv4 port in the network.
So we have to assume that you saw it as a measure of things you could count, but the actual effect at scale on the global network is significantly higher. This is making me think of the Pulse model, the idea of an internet health report, which is also done in IIJ, trying to help quantify these things into simpler measures so that people in policy space, governance space, maybe in LEA, have simpler measures to help them decide, let's focus on this problem. Is that something you're maybe looking towards?
I'm so glad you brought that up, because indeed we are. We've made our first foray into an internet pollution index with, we've updated the website for this project. If you go to gcaaid.org, and I'm sure that will be put in the show notes.
It will indeed.
You will see a world map with a heat index of the amount of pollution we see coming from different countries. And that is calculated, it is normalized based on size of networks, etc., and a few other factors brought into it. So it's not just raw numbers of attacks. And the hope and expectation is that we can start raising awareness with that. We, of course, have all of that data on a per network basis, but we're not actually out to name and shame.
No.
We're trying to raise awareness.
No, there's a commonality, I think, between the approach APNIC has in a member-only service and what you're saying.
Right.
You have to be so careful about holding the flag up over someone in public. So if you start with the nation state or even regional data, it's much easier to bring people into the conversation. We actually found that some communities are more organized than other communities. if I were to showcase one, I'd say the Vietnamese are absolutely amazing. When they're informed that there's a problem inside their boundary, they are really super keen to try and understand what they need to do to mitigate this. And, I like that. I like that we can have a rational conversation. So have you been taking this on the road, Leslie?
We're just starting to take it on the road. And again, we plan to talk some more about it at RIPE in May this year. But before we leave the Vietnamese, I wanted to come back and point out that there's a more recent attack, Mirai botnet, again, a variant of the Mirai botnet, that actually is coming from us. But I think the command and control network actually comes from a single IP address in Vietnam.
Well, that's one we might take offline and have a conversation with VNNIC about, because it would be lovely to tackle the problem. But there's a quality here that I think is, that's one question, but this is many holes in the dike, right?
Absolutely.
This is not a single hole fixes the problem. Do you have other things that are kind of in your mind as questions we need to think about?
So the general question of what is appropriate coming out of networks is sort of a larger question, but the really important thing is to focus on, so then what do we do about it, right? Because as I said, network operators kind of shrug and say, it's not impacting my numbers in terms of bandwidth.
It's very hard to make a case for spend, labour or real money in this area, because it doesn't directly impact your revenue. The earnings per customer aren't going up because you say I've got a clean net. There's very little evidence of that. Maybe we could work on a sell side, but at this time, if I were in network ops, this wouldn't be my number one problem to look at.
Yeah, and I can think of some ways that maybe it could become a number one problem to look at, but they're not very pleasant, and they, largely involve major business issues. Like if you start looking at the cost of these attacks, like the Mirai attack that's just been in the news recently, then the impact of that has real dollar value associated with it to other companies around the globe.
Oh, and that translates very directly to things like business insurance costs as well. So I could well see the reinsurance market or the insurance organisations being agencies who'd look at this and say, guys, you have to lift your game.
It also goes back to the question of reputation, because all of the IP addresses that are regularly involved in this kind of behavior are being noted, not just in our system, but by everybody who's building any kind of defense technology and system. And they're not going to be worth a whole lot on the resale market.
Now you've just kind of slid a message under the counter there. We're moving into a world where addresses used to be critical assets you held for use, into a world where addresses are becoming more ephemeral but necessary. And a lot of agencies with large stocks of internet addresses have potential to realise the capital value. It's true the market used to be at $50 an address, maybe come down to $30, but if you were a former nation-scale telco and you held enough of these addresses, this is hundreds of millions of dollars of capital you could realise. And there is not a CFO in the current economic climate who wouldn't want to know about this. So what you've plonked on the table is, they're worth hundreds of millions, but if you don't deal with the taint coming out of your addresses, they're worth a lot less.
Absolutely. So I think the onward discussion is what is a rational amount of effort for a network to put into observing this kind of behavior and stopping it at source. And again, back to the bookstore analogy, we're not talking about posting a guard at the door and saying you're going to look in every handbag, but there are behaviors that should be observable. And
you can start to do some metrics, counting the till, working out stock holdings and do the difference. And if you can trial that process down to something you can do quickly, you're going to know the days you're losing stock. If you look at the return visits, you're going to know the days people are coming in to see what they can take. So there are processes in measurement that kind of lead directly to an outcome here, if you're smart about how you measure.
Yes.
I like this. That means this really is a measurement story, Leslie.
Woot.
That's great. That's what we're here for. So are you guys interested in developing tools in this space? Is that an area you might do work?
I think that we're mostly interested in working with others have the dialogue about what is reasonable, right? As we
Yeah.
saw in the case with MANRS, right? What brought MANRS into existence, it was a discussion around if you network operators are not in a position to operationally support the proposed standards for routing security, what can you do? So we're sort of in the same situation where rather than us saying, network operators, the world around should do X, Y, and Z, rather talk with them and say, if you were going to achieve this, what could you do? What should we advocate that others do?
Yeah, and it's nice also with the MANRS model that it is the operators themselves coming into a state of saying these are the norms we promote as a minimum requirement. So you could imagine a MANRS for Honeynets, a MANRS for bad traffic. These are the norms for investment you should make in tracking down your own problems in the wider community interest. And if enough of you lift the boat, we're going to get to a better place.
Yes, because stopping it at source will actually have considerable impact in reducing the problem space.
That's an intriguing thought. Community building is probably the hardest thing to do here. And if we kind of go away from technology, it's also the thing that we're least equipped to do. I mean, we are all on this program technologists, right? People listening to this are probably in the network space or students looking at problems, or they're interested in technology. But this isn't really a technology problem. This is a people problem.
Absolutely. And, here we are. Not only are we technologists, but most of us are deeply introverted. And it turns out that the major problem space is addressed through communication.
Yep, the one thing we're no good at doing. So you're doing an attempt to get things started. You're lighting a fire under people about this. You're out communicating about this. You're going to be in RIPE. Where else could we see you talking about this?
Well, I'm kind of a fixture at NANOG, the North American Network Operator Group. So we'll take the message pretty much anywhere that is interested in hearing about it. I think it will also be important to take it out of the networking environment as well, to talk to regional groups and other entities that are interested in the security of the network.
So that also means that there's the potential for an outreach that is off the technology track and more in the LEA space or in the governance conversation.
I think that there is a governance conversation here. I'm always a little bit careful about what I want to suggest is appropriate for regulation or other governance.
It's a delicate area.
I'm going to go back to the point that we want to see measures that are defined by network operators, because they are the ones who know what actually works in their world.
So that actually comes to a place that can work very well for the regulator. They typically don't like to be boots and all coming into a greenfield saying, I'm going to tell you how it'll be. Right. Their approach is much more to say, we've been made aware you guys have a problem. Some of it's from you, some of it's from downstream of you or consumers of you. Right. The best thing here is if you guys come together and agree what you think is the approach. Yeah. And if we come to an agreement with you in that, it's a level playing field. Don't set the ladder too high. Don't put too many costs on yourself. Let's talk about what's a rational level of investment by you, and we'll mark that as the minimum to be in this playing field. It's not a bad approach.
It has been successful in the context of MANRS, and we're hoping to see it be successful in this context as well.
I think MANRS in GCA is a very good fit for the activity that you're doing here, Leslie. I think it's really nice that GCA's picked up this community burden and is carrying that story forward. So the Honeynet itself, that's the honey farm, as you put it, that's quite a big investment in technology, isn't it?
It has been a big investment. It's been a big investment over several years. Our original work was largely focused on doing the data storage and extraction, and we had another entity actually running the honey farm. But we, in the course of the last 6 months, have rolled out, as I said, our own technology, which is really a lot of fun because we can tune it any way we want. We've used that particular technology in instances of deployments before we rolled it out as our sort of base measurement platform. Yeah. We used it to do some studies of what actually happens in a smart home with Which in the UK. And they had a number of smart home devices that they wanted to test, and put them behind one of our honey bots and just to see what happened. And I think it was a matter of minutes
Yeah.
before the first video camera fell over.
There are two qualities here that come to mind. Jeff Houston's been fond of saying it's not the Internet of Things, it's the Internet of Dumb Things. Jacques Latour from Sierra in Canada was quite interested in the idea of getting a tick mark up within the Canadian technology community, because these devices essentially become orphans. They're flooded out into the market and they're sold as amazing smart technology, and then they never get a field upgrade.
Absolutely.
And so the risk here is that older devices typically have lower barriers against sophisticated attacks.
Yes.
They might be good for the day they're sold, but 5 years down the track, if you've still got a smart light bulb in the corner, it's probably a target for attack.
And this is another one of the reasons why I favor trying to address things at source rather than just, build more moats around deployments. Because in this recent round of Mirai attacking, it was a number of the older devices that were particularly hit hard. And as you say, they're deployed and they may be physically inaccessible. So it would be better to have less ability for these kinds of attacks to circulate and gain momentum than just to say, well, you really should put a VPN in front of your lights.
So do you think that this will wind up being an additional burden on the NOC? Is this heading to a network operations group in an ISP to resolve? Or are we talking about a new specialist grouping that has to exist alongside classic operations to deal with this?
I'm not going to speculate too hard about which path it's going to be, but I will say that I think it should lead to more agreed expectations about what it means to run a network properly.
So you kind of stop at, there's an obligation emerging, you're not going to tell people how they can tackle it. But it's a different skill set, right? I mean, you really have to have a slightly different sense of what you're doing here. It's not just as simple as configuring a switch and bringing it up.
Yes.
It's the management of the ACL and the reverse path forwarding in those states. And it's also looking at information flows and intuiting problems against trend lines. It's
an important piece of it is understanding your network, right? Understanding what is normal in your network and what should be normal in your network. And neither am I a fan of stifling all activity that looks new and unusual and saying it must be bad. To your point about having to do, re-authenticate yourself to systems because they think something looks a little funny now. In the same way, you have to make sure that you don't create networks that just say either you connect to the 3 servers I'll bless, or you can't use the network. But there is an element of understanding what is unusual behavior.
So a part of this that interests me is that many things in measurement come to this point of full packet capture and post hoc analysis as opposed to sampling in the stream. And I have a very strong sense you're never going to be in a world where a full packet capture gets you where you need to be. You are living in sample in the stream.
Yeah.
And I'll throw back at you a version of your question. How much data do you have to sample to be able to get a sense at scale of how big your problem is?
Are you talking about as a network operator or in terms of looking at what we're doing, which is looking at all the traffic in the world?
So you've got a Honeynet investment of 200 to 300 devices, and you're getting a sense of density of problem based on the attacks coming at you. But if I were a network operator, if I deployed one Honeynet system in my core, would that be enough to give me the beginnings? Or do I have to have a deployment of one at every NOC, every node?
Yeah.
What's my cost of entry if I'm starting to think I want to engage here?
So I think what you probably want to do at that point is actually talk to somebody who has a honey farm and ask them, what are you seeing out of my network?
Right. So day one is get a sense of the scale of your problem.
Right.
And that would help direct what level of investment you might want to make.
And the rest of the instrumentation in your own network, I think, has to do a lot more with understanding what kinds of connections are being made from the nodes in your network, and where are they reaching to? And are these regular patterns? Are they suddenly reaching to whole new countries?
So we see quite interesting behaviours in APNIC labs when we look at traffic trends like V6. There's a very strong weekday, weekend traffic profile. And I think there's a quality here that it actually becomes an important question. Are you in service to the general market, or are you in a small and medium enterprise or a government department? Because you would expect your machines are essentially idle at the weekend in a government context, whereas in my home, when I'm not there, they shouldn't be doing very much. So it's kind of inverse models, right? It's very contextual to the nature of your market.
And it's probably going to be highly contextual depending on your own circumstances. So, I mean, as a separate piece of work, there's work to be done in profiling what is normal in your network, in your small network.
If we had smart profiles and I could put maybe 5 qualities into I'm going to call it an engine, I could get out of it a statement. The general community consensus is for a 20,000 customer mobile related service, you'd expect to see this general level. And if you're above that threshold, you really need to ask yourself why.
Yes, and again, it's sort of like know your customer, but it's more know your network, right? If you have a baseline and understand where your general connection types are, it's when you see sudden variations from that, you might want to ask a question.
So Leslie, where next with this? I mean, where are you going with this? Is there a 2-year or 5-year plan?
So a lot of it depends on sort of the responses that we get, because since we aren't creating the lists of rules and regulations that we are going to try to impose on people, we need people to come out and play and, have the discussions with us. So for, I think I made the offer the last time that we spoke. If anybody who's listening would like to know what do we see from their network in our honey farm, I'd be happy to provide a report.
I really strongly recommend people to think about having a look at this data. So I would say the first thing that would be there's a benefit in this conversation is go and look at the GCA website and try to understand what it can tell you about yourself. People put their AS number in or an address.
Well, let us know the AS number, and we're not sharing this data publicly, so we're interested in, contact us.
There's a bit of a 2FA to do because you've got to know who you're talking to.
Yeah, and then we can share the data that we see from some perspective.
So if I were in a community like maybe Sanog in the South Asian footprint, there's a way we could invite you in the door to talk about problems in our region. You might be able to prepare something there.
Yep, that would be fun. I neglected to mention I'll actually be giving a keynote at the ARIN meeting at the end of April in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is going to look at the larger question of sort of how do we address the security problems in general.
Oh, that's one that people should definitely look out for. And there's a blog stream on the GCA site. You're writing things up.
Yes, never as much as we feel we ought to, but yes.
And if I'm already at a point that I'm motivated, you've got pointers for tools and a way to bootstrap some engagement here?
If you're already motivated and you think you have answers, we would be welcome. We would be very happy to work with you to start building some community around that. And
yeah. At the moment, you're still stuck in questions, Leslie.
We have a lot of questions.
Yeah. This has been absolutely fascinating. I hope we can get you back to talk about this again. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you so much.
If you've got a story or research to share here on Ping, why not get in contact by email to ping@apnic.net or via the APNIC social media channels. Also, remember that the Measurement at apnic.net mailing list on Orbit is there to discuss and share relevant collaborative opportunities, grants and funding opportunities, jobs and graduate placings, or to seek feedback from the community about your own measurement projects. Be sure to check out the APNIC website for all your resource and community needs. Until next time.